Okay, so let's dive in. Today, it's philosophy of religion.
Right, those big questions. Why are we here? What's the point of it all?
Yeah, the nature of reality, meaning of life, but, approached through that philosophical lens.
I think for our listeners, people who really want to get a good grasp on things, this is going to be a good one because we're going to unpack some pretty profound ideas and look at different viewpoints and different perspectives.
Yeah, and our main source material for this deep dive is the philosophy of religion entry from no less than the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
It is a very comprehensive piece covering, well, basically everything, the history, the key concepts, all the debates, and that's what keeps it interesting.
Yeah. So what we want to do in this deep dive is distill those key takeaways so that you, the listener, get a solid understanding of what philosophy of religion is all about, what kind of questions it tries to answer, and why it even matters in the first place.
And without, overwhelming you with too much information.
Exactly. So I guess starting with the basics, what is the philosophy of religion?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines it as the philosophical examination of religious traditions and concepts
Hmm.
and the nature of religion itself.
Right. So not just like, is there a God, but like, what does it even mean to be religious?
That's exactly right. And it's also broader than that. I mean, it also delves into alternative concepts of ultimate reality, and how people find religious significance not only in their beliefs, but also in the universe and in historical events.
So, like, looking at how people find meaning in things, even if they don't subscribe to a specific religion.
Yeah. And what's even more interesting, it doesn't just stop at studying religion. It also looks at non-religious worldviews, like secular naturalism, for example. So it's not just about understanding religion, it's about comparing it to other ways of thinking about existence.
Right. So, like, how does a religious worldview compare to, say, a purely scientific worldview? And and this isn't just some niche area of philosophy. It seems like it's connected to almost every major branch of a philosophical inquiry.
Right. I mean, from metaphysics, the study of the nature of reality, to epistemology, which is how we know things, even to value theory, which is like what's good, what's bad, philosophy of language. I mean, it touches on everything. And and not just those core philosophical areas, it also has connections to science, history, art. I mean, it's really woven into the whole fabric of thought.
It's almost like a central hub connecting all these different areas of inquiry.
That's a great way to put it.
So thinking about the history of this field, it's fascinating, right? People have been pondering these big questions about gods and the cosmos basically forever.
Right. I mean, philosophical reflection on religion has been around, well, since the very beginnings of philosophy itself. I mean, in ancient Greece, in India, in China, thinkers were already grappling with these questions long before philosophy of religion became like a formally recognized discipline.
Right, so the questions are ancient, but the formalization of it as a field of study is more recent.
Yeah. It seems like it gradually emerged as a distinct field around maybe the mid-20th century. But the Stanford entry does highlight the Cambridge Platonists of the 17th century as important early figures. They were really influential.
Interesting. So I mean, why should anyone care about all this? Why is philosophy of religion important?
Well, there are several reasons. One, it gives you those intellectual tools to compare and evaluate different religious traditions, and not just that, also those alternative worldviews we talked about.
So like you can use these tools to see how different belief systems stack up against each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can analyze those core assumptions, understand those arguments, and see those strengths and weaknesses in each perspective. And in a world where we have so many diverse beliefs, that kind of critical thinking skill is so valuable.
It's like having a framework for understanding these really big, important questions.
Yeah, it's about those fundamental questions that both religion and philosophy have always grappled with. The nature of reality, the limits of human knowledge, what gives life meaning, what happens after we die. I mean, it's all there.
It's almost like a roadmap to navigating those big existential questions.
Yeah, and if you're interested in the history of philosophy itself,
Hmm.
you really can't ignore philosophy of religion because so many major philosophers throughout history, like Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Descartes, Hume, Kant, I mean, the list goes on, they all engaged with religious ideas.
It's like trying to understand a puzzle without all the pieces.
Exactly. And it also plays a crucial role in understanding theology and religious studies more broadly because it helps you understand those philosophical underpinnings of religious thought. For instance, the entry points out how In many Asian traditions, philosophy and religion are completely intertwined. You can't separate them. And even in the Abrahamic traditions, there are philosophical elements woven into the sacred texts. Like think about the Book of Job in the Bible. That's a deeply philosophical text.
So it's philosophy of religion is the key to unlocking a deeper understanding of religious thought itself.
Exactly.
So how did philosophers traditionally approach the meaning of religious beliefs?
Well, for a very long time, the dominant approach was a form of realism.
Yeah.
And that's the view that religious claims are essentially assertions that are either true or false. And this applied to pretty much everyone involved in these discussions. You know, whether you agreed or disagreed with a specific religious claim, you were still operating within that framework of truth and falsity.
So it's like saying, okay, we may disagree on what's true, but we at least agree that there is a truth to be found.
Right, exactly.
But how does language factor into all of this? I mean, the language we use when we talk about religion isn't always straightforward.
That's a great point. And the Stanford entry actually talks about the different ways philosophers have understood religious language.
Yeah.
You know, distinguishing between those univocal, analogical, and equivocal uses of terms when we apply them to both God and humans.
So, like, when we say God knows everything, do we mean knows in the same way that we mean it when we say, I know my name?
That's exactly the kind of question that philosophers of religion grapple with.
It seems like that could get really complicated really quickly.
It definitely can. And what's even more fascinating is the distinction that philosophers make between those via positiva and the via negativa.
Now, those are some big words. Break those down for me.
So the via positiva, which is sometimes called cataphatic theology, emphasizes that we actually can form positive concepts of the divine. You know, we can say what God is like, even if it's always going to be imperfect. And then there's the via negativa, also known as apophatic theology, which stresses those inherent limits of our understanding, and that the ultimate nature of God is basically unknowable.
So, like, we can say what God is not, but not really what God is.
Right. Maimonides, the medieval Jewish philosopher, is a key figure associated with that via negativa. He argued that we primarily come to know God through understanding what God is not, rather than trying to define what God is directly.
That seems like a pretty humbling approach.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
But it raises an interesting tension. The entry talks about that tension between the via negativa, this idea that God is ultimately beyond our grasp, and the actual practices of religion, you know, like prayer and worship.
So it's like, how can you meaningfully engage with something that you believe is fundamentally incomprehensible? So all of that approach to religious beliefs, that realism we were talking about, it faced some pretty serious challenges in the 20th century.
Yeah, from two major philosophical movements, logical positivism and Wittgensteinian philosophy of religion. And these movements really pushed philosophers to reconsider what we even mean when we make religious claims.
Okay, so let's unpack that. First, logical positivism.
So the logical positivists, they were all about a very strict empirical account of meaning. They said, look, for a statement to be meaningful, it has to be either a logical truth, like in mathematics, or something that we can verify or falsify through observation. So basically, if you couldn't test it empirically, it was meaningless.
So if you couldn't see it, touch it, or measure it, it wasn't real.
Pretty much. And they applied that same standard to religious claims. And they said, well, you can't observe God empirically. So statements about God are meaningless. A.J. Ayer, he was one of the key figures in that movement. He said that statements about God, and even those statements denying the existence of God, they didn't meet that standard of meaningfulness. They weren't analytic definitions, and you couldn't test them. So he said they were basically nonsense.
So not only was talking about God meaningless, but so was talking about not believing in God.
Yeah, that's how they saw it. It's all meaningless. Antony Flew, another philosopher from that school of thought, had that great analogy of the invisible gardener. Imagine there are two people, and they come across a clearing in the woods. One of them says, oh, there must be a gardener who tends this clearing. The other says, no, there's no gardener. So they set up tests, they put up fences, they bring in bloodhounds, they do everything they can to find this gardener, but they find no evidence. The person who believes in the gardener keeps qualifying their belief. They say, well, maybe the gardener is invisible. Maybe the gardener is intangible. Maybe the gardener doesn't leave any footprints. And Flew's point is, at some point, that belief becomes so qualified, so watered down, that it's basically empty. It's meaningless. because there's no conceivable way to disprove it.
It's like saying, well, there's a unicorn in my backyard, but it's invisible and it doesn't leave any traces.
Exactly.
So the logical positivists, they were pretty tough on religious language. But they weren't just tough on religion, were they?
No, they weren't. They were equally tough on ethics. They said that moral statements were just expressions of personal feelings lacking any real cognitive content. So for them, saying murder is wrong was no different than saying, I don't like chocolate.
This seems like a pretty extreme position.
It was. And eventually, logical positivism started to run into some pretty serious problems. And it led to its decline.
So what were some of those problems?
Well, first of all, that principle of verification that they championed, it seemed to be self-refuting. I mean, if you apply that principle to itself, if you ask, is the statement only empirically verifiable or analytic statements are meaningful itself empirically verifiable? Well, the answer is no. So by its own standards, that very principle was meaningless.
So it's like they created a rule that they couldn't even follow themselves.
Right. And another problem was that many people argued that there are clearly meaningful statements about the world that aren't subject to direct empirical verification. Like statements about historical events that we didn't witness, or statements about the inner lives of other people. We can't directly observe those things, but we still consider them meaningful.
It's like saying that the only things that are real are the things that we can see and touch right now.
Exactly.
So it seems like logical positivism was a bit too narrow in its view of what constitutes meaning.
Yeah, I mean, it felt very limiting. And there were also those inconsistencies, like with Ayer dismissing ethics, while at the same time making these strong claims about what constitutes a justified belief. It just didn't seem to hang together.
Right. It's like saying morals are meaningless, but then making a moral judgment about what's a good belief.
Exactly. And then there's Karl Hempel, another philosopher. He offered a really powerful critique of logical positivism. He pointed out that scientific inquiry doesn't operate on these isolated empirical claims. It operates within these broader theories, these frameworks that help us make sense of the world. And that opens the door again for those metaphysical accounts of reality, including theistic ones.
So it's not just about individual observations, it's about how those observations fit into a bigger picture.
Exactly.
Okay, so logical positivism had its flaws. What about Wittgensteinian philosophy of religion? How did that challenge the traditional understanding of religious beliefs?
So Wittgenstein, he's a fascinating figure. In his later work, he shifted his focus away from that picture theory of meaning, that idea that language gets its meaning by directly representing reality. He said, no, that's not how language works. He said that the meaning of language is found in its use, in its actual use within these forms of life, these social and cultural contexts.
So, like, the meaning of a word isn't just some abstract definition, it's how it's actually used in everyday life.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does that apply to religion?
Well, thinkers like D.Z. Phillips, they took Wittgenstein's ideas and applied them to religion. They said, look, we shouldn't be so focused on the truth or falsity of religious claims in some abstract metaphysical sense. Instead, we should look at how religious language actually functions in the lives of religious people.
So, like, what does it actually mean to someone when they say, I believe in God?
Right. So, for example, they might say that prayer isn't necessarily an attempt to, like, causally influence a transcendent God, but it might be a way of expressing solidarity with a community, or a way of coming to terms with existential anxieties, or articulating a certain way of seeing the world.
So it's more about the role that religious language plays in people's lives, rather than about whether it corresponds to some objective truth.
Right. And the Stanford entry actually quotes Phillips, saying that there is a God, though it appears to be in the indicative mood, is an expression of faith. So for him, it's not a statement of fact, it's a statement of faith, of commitment.
It's like saying, I believe in love, not necessarily as some objective force in the universe, but as something that shapes how you live your life.
Exactly. And this approach, it had a certain appeal, right? It seemed more grounded in that lived experience of religious belief. And it sidestepped those seemingly irresolvable debates about the metaphysical status of religious claims.
Right. It's like saying, okay, we may never know for sure whether God exists, but that's not the point. The point is how this belief functions in people's lives.
That's it.
But I imagine not everyone was on board with that approach.
Of course not. I mean, a lot of philosophers pushed back and said, look, at the heart of religious life, people do hold beliefs about what is actually the case. It seems counterintuitive to say that someone could genuinely pray to a god that they believe exists only as like a linguistic construct or a shared cultural practice with no real objective reality.
So it's like you wouldn't pray to Santa Claus because you know Santa Claus isn't real, but if you're praying to God, you must believe on some level that God is real.
Yeah, and that's where that debate about the meaning of religious beliefs continues. It's a really lively area in philosophy of religion.
So if we accept that people do hold these beliefs, the next question is, how do we know if they're justified?
Exactly. And that takes us into the realm of religious epistemology.
Okay, so what is religious epistemology?
Basically, it's that branch of philosophy that looks at the epistemic status of our propositional attitudes about religious claims. In simpler terms, it's about asking, what, if anything, justifies us in believing religious things? What makes those beliefs rational?
So it's like we have all these different religious beliefs out there, but what makes some of them more reasonable than others?
Exactly. And the entry points out that pretty much every methodology within epistemology has been applied to religious claims. So you have those rationalistic approaches that emphasize reason and logic. You have experiential approaches that focus on religious experience, historical approaches. I mean, you name it.
It's like there's no one-size-fits-all approach to figuring out what's true when it comes to religion.
Exactly. And there's also been a lot of discussion about the nature of religious faith itself. Is it primarily a matter of holding certain beliefs as true? Or is it something more like trust, hope, allegiance, commitment, or even action that doesn't necessarily require explicit belief? I mean, John Schellenberg, he's a contemporary philosopher who's argued for the possibility of faith without belief.
So it's like you can have faith in something even if you're not entirely sure if it's true.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's about that deep trust or commitment, even in the face of uncertainty.
Okay, so the entry goes on to discuss some key positions within religious epistemology. One of those is evidentialism.
Right. Evidentialism, in its simplest form, says that a belief is justified only if you have adequate evidence for it. And the strength of your belief should be proportional to the strength of that evidence.
So like the more evidence you have, the stronger your belief can be.
Exactly. And Richard Swinburne, he's a leading contemporary proponent of theistic natural theology. And he takes that evidentialist approach. He builds arguments for God's existence based on empirical observations of the world.
So it's like looking at the world around us and seeing evidence for God's handiwork.
Yeah, that's the basic idea.
But even within evidentialism, there are different approaches, right?
Yeah. I mean, you have John Schellenberg, who we mentioned earlier, who's developed that influential argument from divine hiddenness.
Remind me about that one.
Right. So he's basically saying that if there was a perfectly loving God, God would make his existence much more obvious to us. And the fact that we don't see that clear, unambiguous evidence, well, that counts against God's existence.
So it's like if God really wanted us to know he was there, he would make it a lot easier for us to see him.
That's his argument.
Okay, interesting. So that's one side of the evidentialist coin. What about the other side?
Well, you have other thinkers, like Menson and Sullivan, who say, well, maybe we should approach philosophical reflection on religion by starting within a particular religious tradition, like Christianity. They say that starting with that specific context gives you a richer database, including all those theological doctrines and historical narratives. And they say that helps you make more sense of things like the problem of evil, for example.
So it's like if you start with the assumption that Christianity is true, then the problem of evil looks different than if you're just starting from a neutral philosophical standpoint.
Right. They say it's more about understanding the internal coherence of a particular worldview, rather than trying to judge it from the outside.
Okay, interesting. So evidentialism has its supporters, but it also has its critics, right?
Yeah, definitely. Some argue that it sets the bar too high for religious belief. They say it's unreasonable to demand the same level of proof for religious claims as we might demand for, say, scientific claims.
So it's like saying, well, you can't prove that God exists with the same certainty that you can prove that gravity exists, so therefore belief in God is irrational.
Right. And one alternative to evidentialism that's mentioned in the entry is reliabilism.
So what's reliabilism?
Basically, reliabilism says that a belief is justified if it's formed by a reliable belief-forming process, even if the person holding that belief isn't consciously aware of all the evidence. So, for example, a religious experience could be considered a reliable source of belief, even if the person can't articulate all the reasons why they believe.
So it's more about the process of forming the belief than the evidence itself.
Right. It's saying that if the process is reliable, then the belief is more likely to be true, even if the person can't give you a detailed argument for why they believe.
Okay, so we've talked about evidentialism and reliabilism. What are some of the other key positions within religious epistemology?
Well, there's Reformed epistemology, which is most closely associated with Alvin Plantinga and Nicholas Wolterstorff.
What's their take?
They draw on John Calvin's idea of the sensus divinitatis. That's this innate sense of God that Calvin believed was part of human nature.
So it's like we're born with a sense of God.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And Reformed epistemology argues that belief in God can be properly basic, meaning it doesn't need to be supported by other beliefs or arguments in order to be rational. It's more of a defensive strategy. They're not necessarily trying to prove that God exists, but they're saying that belief in God isn't necessarily irrational, even if it doesn't have that external proof.
So it's like saying, look, I don't need to prove that God exists because I just have this basic sense that God is there.
Exactly.
Okay, what else is there?
Well, there's also volitional epistemology, which is associated with Paul Moser. And he argues that the God of Christianity specifically wouldn't make his existence obvious to people who aren't willing to seek him out and undergo a process of moral and spiritual transformation.
So it's like you have to be open to the possibility of God in order to see the evidence.
Yes, that's the idea. It's not just about intellectual assent. It's about that personal transformation and lived commitment.
Okay, so we've got all these different approaches to religious knowledge, but there's also the problem of disagreement, right? I mean, people disagree about religion all the time.
Right, and the entry talks about how to understand that disagreement, especially the fact that seemingly reasonable people, even when they're using similar philosophical methodologies, can arrive at these completely incompatible religious beliefs.
It's like we're all looking at the same world, but we're seeing completely different things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a real challenge, especially when you see it playing out in dialogues between different faiths, like between Christians and Muslims, for example. They often share a common philosophical heritage, but they come to very different conclusions about God, about salvation, about all sorts of things.
So how do you even begin to make sense of that kind of disagreement?
Well, one response that's mentioned in the entry is epistemological pluralism.
Okay, what's that?
It's basically the idea that individuals might be equally justified in holding these mutually exclusive beliefs, given their different starting points and experiences. It's like saying, look, there's no single objective truth when it comes to religion. What's true for you might not be true for me.
That seems like a very tolerant approach.
It is. It encourages a kind of epistemic humility where we recognize that we might not have all the answers. And we're open to the possibility that other people might be right, even if we disagree with them.
So it's about recognizing that there might be multiple valid perspectives on the same issue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the entry also points out that our beliefs aren't always under our direct control. It's not always a simple matter of choosing what to believe. Even if we intellectually acknowledge that other people hold different views, we might not be able to just choose to abandon what seems deeply true to us.
It's like you can't just flip a switch and change your beliefs.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about religious belief, religious knowledge. What about the relationship between religion and science?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Hmm.
And the entry rightly points out that it's a very important topic in contemporary philosophy of religion. It starts by referencing a statement from the National Academy of Sciences.
And what does that statement say?
Well, it basically says that science and religion operate in these separate domains of human experience. Science is concerned with the natural world. It relies on empirical evidence, while religion often deals with those supernatural claims, and it's not necessarily dependent on empirical validation.
So it's like saying that science and religion are each asking different kinds of questions.
Right, and Stephen Jay Gould famously called this the idea of non-overlapping magisteria. Like they each have their own separate areas of authority.
Okay, so that sounds like a pretty neat way to avoid conflict. But I imagine it's not quite that simple.
Yeah, you're right. The entry points out some potential problems with that neat separation.
So what are some of those problems?
Well, one problem is that historically, and even today, people often think that religious beliefs are supported or challenged by evidence from the natural world. Think about those arguments for God based on the apparent order of the universe, or the fine-tuning of the laws of physics.
So it's like people are using scientific discoveries to support their religious beliefs.
Right, and on the other hand, people also use scientific discoveries to challenge certain religious beliefs. Like if you discover that the universe is billions of years old, that might challenge a literal interpretation of the creation account in the Bible.
So it seems like science and religion aren't always so neatly separated.
Exactly. And the entry also points out that while modern science largely brackets out those colons of mind and consciousness, the early pioneers of science, people like Kepler and Newton, they saw their scientific work as being deeply connected to their religious beliefs.
So for them, science and religion weren't in conflict, they were actually complementary?
Exactly. They saw their scientific discoveries as revealing God's handiwork.
Okay, interesting. So what about contemporary views on the relationship between science and religion?
Well, the entry presents some really different perspectives.
Like what?
Well, it brings up Steven Pinker. He's a cognitive scientist, and he argues that science has basically shown that the core belief systems of all traditional religions are just factually mistaken.
So he's saying that science has disproven religion.
That's essentially his argument. He points to things like the theory of evolution, which contradicts traditional accounts of human origins, or the understanding of natural laws as not having any inherent purpose or goal, which goes against the idea that the universe was designed for us.
Okay, so that's a pretty strong claim. What about the other side?
Well, the entry also presents Michael Ruse's view. He's a philosopher of science. And he argues that Pinker's overstating the case. He says that many religious believers already acknowledge that certain traditional historical claims might not be tenable in light of scientific evidence. But those historical claims aren't necessarily central to their faith.
So it's like saying that you can still believe in God even if you don't believe in a literal six-day creation.
Exactly. And he suggests that it's more accurate to think of science as methodologically agnostic, meaning that it doesn't take a stance on God's existence or non-existence as part of its method.
So science is neutral on the question of God.
That's his argument. It's not trying to prove or disprove God. It's just trying to understand the natural world.
Okay, interesting. So we've covered a lot of ground so far. What about arguments for and against God's existence?
Right. The entry delves into those classic arguments.
Okay, so what's the starting point for those arguments?
Well, it's important to note that today, those arguments for God's existence, they're rarely presented as like these knockdown, irrefutable proofs. It's more about building a cumulative case where you have several lines of reasoning that, when taken together, suggest that theism is a plausible belief.
So it's like building a case in a courtroom. You might not have one smoking gun, but you have a lot of circumstantial evidence that points to the same conclusion.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are some of those lines of reasoning?
Well, you have those ontological arguments, which are unique because they try to establish God's existence purely based on reason, on the concept of God itself.
So it's like just by thinking about what God is, you can prove that God exists.
That's the basic idea.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, the most famous example is Anselm's ontological argument. He focuses on the idea of God as the greatest conceivable being. And he argues that such a being must necessarily exist, because if it didn't exist, it wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being.
So it's like saying that the very idea of God includes the idea of existence. Okay, but that seems like a pretty tricky argument.
It definitely is. And there are a lot of objections to it. One objection is that you could use the same kind of reasoning to argue for the existence of all sorts of impossible things. Like, you could say that the greatest conceivable island must exist, because if it didn't, it wouldn't be the greatest conceivable island.
So the argument seems a bit too powerful.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. But there are modern versions of the ontological argument that try to address those objections, and they often focus on the possibility of God's necessary existence.
Okay, so that's one type of argument. What else is there?
Well, there are also those cosmological arguments, and they take a more empirical approach. They start with observations about the universe, and they try to argue back to the existence of a cause or a ground for the universe.
So it's like looking at the world around us and saying, well, all this stuff had to come from somewhere.
Right. And they often distinguish between those arguments for a first cause in time. So like, what caused the Big Bang? And those arguments for a necessary sustaining cause of the universe.
So not just what started the universe, but what keeps it going.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so how do those arguments work?
Well, they often rely on the idea that the universe can't just be a brute fact. There has to be some explanation for why it exists.
Yeah.
And they argue that the best explanation is God.
So it's like saying that the universe is too complex in order to have just happened by chance.
Right.
Okay, but what about the Big Bang? I mean, science says that the universe started with the Big Bang. Doesn't that explain where it came from?
Well, the cosmological arguments would say that the Big Bang itself needs an explanation. What caused the Big Bang? And why are the laws of physics the way they are? These are the kinds of questions that they're trying to answer.
So it's like pushing the question back a step further.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. So ontological arguments and cosmological arguments. What other kinds of arguments are there for God's existence?
Well, there are those teleological arguments,
Yeah.
and they focus on the apparent design or order or purpose that we see in the universe.
So it's like looking at a watch and saying, this is too complex to have just happened by chance. There must have been a watchmaker.
Exactly.
Yep.
They say that the universe is like a giant watch, and that points to the existence of a designer, God.
Okay, so what are some examples of that apparent design?